Welcome back. We're going to continue with our series on the rain and raindrop splash and the fog tutorial here. And we're going to do the second part, and we're going to create a rain splash that's going to occur along with the rain. Now, I talked in the last video, what we had here was I actually had a small object, a splash cylinder, and then that splash cylinder, I created a material to put on there, how I created the material. And what we're going to do now is we're actually going to bring it in, and we're going to have a particle system made out of this particular object, which is something that's important to know that you can do, because this is a great way for us to spawn a wide variety of things, enemies, whatever it happens to be. We can spawn them, and we can have them fall from the sky, or a lot of different things that we can do. You can use particle systems to grow plants at an accelerated rate. There's a lot of things that you can do once you understand the basics of either starting with a particle system, straight particles, or bringing in and actually using meshes or something else to create your particle system. So that's kind of what we're going to do. I'll pull that back off to the side. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my particle system again. So let's go back and look for my particle rain 2. Bring it back up here. This is where we left off. So I've got my rain system coming up. So what we're going to do now is we're going to add a second particle emitter to this. So the way we do this is we just move over here to the right, and we right click and say new particle sprite emitter. It's going to bring in a blank one. What I'm going to do right away is I'm going to go ahead and come up here, and I'm going to right click, and I'm going to rename this one, and we're going to call this rain splashes. And that becomes important when you go back and rename something, because if you do have something that may have 4, 5, 6, 8, 10 of these things up here, and you'll see when we do the snow, we're going to have, I believe, 4 of them up here. It's good to know which ones are which. Raindrops and rain splashes, there's only 2 things, and maybe you think you can get away with that. But I would just get in the habit of naming these things up here, because you can, and that way you can refer back to it and turn it off or turn it back on or do whatever you want. You know which one you're working with. In this particular case, I am going to go back here and turn my raindrops off for a moment, just to help conserve some memory. All right, now, in this particular one, under required, rather than go in here in required, I'm going to need to have a splash particle in here, because I'm going to need a particle effect. And basically, I think if I can zoom around and look and see where my particle system is, it's not there yet. It'll show up here in a second. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and go to required, and I'm going to add in the material that I'm going to need. So I'm going to pull that out of the side over there, and I'm going to go back and look for my splash material. It's right there. And I'll come back over, and I'm going to add that in. And it's going to compile the shaders. It's going to take here a couple of moments, but I'll just keep talking and going from there. So that's the first thing that I'm going to do. Now, we're not going to make this one GPU sprites, because the GPU sprite is something that's generated by the processor. It's not actually generated by the particle system itself. Okay, this one is going to be something we're going to generate from the particle system. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in this black area right here. I'm going to right click. I'm going to go to type data, and instead of saying GPU sprites, I'm going to say mesh data. And then when I select it, it's going to ask me what it is. And right now there's a little particle cube there, just so there's something on the screen. And then I go back over here and say, no, actually what I want to use is my little splash cylinder. So I select it down there, and I'll come over here and I'll say add that in like this. Make sure I'm looking at unlit. There we go. So there we have our particle system. Now if I turn the rain back on, you'll see there's rain going on. Those things are huge, but nonetheless, at least I have that object is being generated as a small mesh. Okay, now I'm going to go back over here. Let's look back again at my required, which is where I've got that material is then plugged into that thing, so it's showing up. In fact, if I reset that back to, we'll just reset that back. because I really don't need an emitter in there, because it's, I mean a texture, because it's on that object already. So I have that going on. Now we're dealing with the same basic elements that are in here. We're going to have we want an endless loop of them, so we're going to say 0 on my emitter loops. We want them to be facing the camera. This is not so important. This is an actual 3D object. So I can swing around the side of this thing. I can look at it from all angles. It's not actually pointing and looking at me. So that renders this section in through here, PSA square, and this sort mode becomes irrelevant, because I'm actually dealing with an actual object in there. Okay, now we're going to go to spawn. What I'm going to do on the spawn here is I've got 1500 raindrops, and what I'm going to do is I'll set this to be the same. I want about the same number of particles here. Now, they don't match. They're not going to be in the same place at the same time. All I'm looking for here is to actually have an equivalent number, and I may go back and in order to make it look better, I may go back and adjust that a little bit later on and add some more into there. But that's really all I need to do for that and through here. When we get into lifetime now, lifetime, we're dealing with a relatively short lifespan. These little elements are going to spawn, and they're going to actually animate in their size. So what I'm going to do on this one, I want them to have a relatively short life, so I'm just going to make this one, both of them are going to be the same, 0.1. And you can see, it looks like a little vibrating drop of rain right there. It is tweaking a little bit. They're living just a little bit, and if I set this to maybe the maximum 0.15, we would still see a slight growth in that one, but it doesn't really matter one way or the other. Okay, for my initial size, I'm going to have to go back, and these need to be really small. Right now, that size is 25, and this is the one where I talked about normally you don't have to deal with the Z. This one I do, because we're actually going to animate this thing growing in its size here. So I need a Z. It's a three-dimensional object. So I'm just going to go in and make this 1 by 1. Take a second for my computer to catch up. 1 again. And then we're going to go down and we'll make some of these 0.5, 0.5, and 0.5. And I'll zoom in so we can kind of see what's happening. Almost looks like a flame, and you'll notice that's probably how we're going to make a flame, and that's pretty close. Now, my initial velocity. In this particular case, I don't really have an initial velocity. It's not animating. It's not moving. Right now, this is set to move up at 100 units, and it's moving side to side. So I'm going to set that side to side action to 0 and 0, and 0 and 0. And now what I have is I have these things going straight up, and I actually want those at 0 and 0. I don't want any real movement. Those things are supposed to, we're going to do something else with that here. We don't really need to have those things jumping up and down and doing those kinds of things that they do. Now, again, color over life, I'm not changing the color of this object, so I'm going to right-click and I'm going to delete it. But I want to add in an initial color. And that will keep this looking the way that it does. So I'm going to right-click, I'm going to go to color, and I'm going to say initial color. Now, if I click on it, I do have a start color, and I've got a start alpha on this one. So if I wanted to, I could have it change colors as it goes through its lifespan. But the lifespan is really short. This is just supposed to look like a little splash that occurs and disappears pretty quickly. So I just want to have that initial color in there just in case I need it for later on. Then what I want to do is I want this thing to change its shape during its lifetime. So what we're going to do is we're going to right-click and we're going to look at size, and we're going to opt for something called size by life. Okay, I'm going to click on that and open it up so I can actually make some changes to it, because this is kind of an interesting one, and this one's going to take a couple of seconds to go through and explain so you can kind of see what's happening here. All right, so I have over here in my details panel my life multiplier, and I'm going to open this up, and I'll probably have to make that a little bit smaller to get this all in here so we can see the entire thing. Okay, I have life multiplier, distribution, vector, constant curve. Now, a constant curve means that it goes from point A to point B. So in the course of its life, it spawns, that's point A, it dies, that's point B. I can add any other alternate position along that timeline. So I can say there's a point A, which is 0, a point B, which is, say, halfway through its life, or 0.5, and I have the end of its life, which would be 1. If the lifespan is 0 to 1, 0.5 is halfway, so it would do something at the beginning, something at the middle, and something at the end. And we call that a curve. Even though it's not physically a curve, it can be a curve if we want it to be. So we're looking for that, and a vector has to do with an area. So it's going to be appearing in an area, and it's going to change on a curve over its lifetime. Now when I open up constant curve completely so I can see it, I see there are 2 points. There's point 0, which is, I talked about, the beginning of its life, and point 1, or the point 1 is the end of its life. Okay, and it says 2 elements. Each one of those elements has 5 members. If I open these up so you can see them, it talks about the 5 members. There's an in value, an out value, an arrive tangent, a leave tangent, and an interpretive mode, which kind of deals with how we would like to see these things, do what they need to do. But there's only 2 points. There's point A and there's point 0 and point 1, beginning and end. And I'd like to have a third one in there, so I'm going to click the little plus sign here. And it takes a second again. But now I've got 0, 1, and 2. So what I basically have here is I've got 0 on the timeline. I have 1 is going to be the middle of its life somewhere, and 2 is going to be the end of its life somewhere. That is what the in value is. Now you'll notice it's gone. And you might be like, well, why is it gone? Well, that's because it starts out here at a size. And halfway through it's at a size, and then at the end it's at no size at all. So what it's doing is it's actually cycling through those things so fast, from 0 to 2 so fast, it just disappears. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, look, the first point right here, my in value is going to be 1. I don't want to see it, so I'm going to leave that at 0. And then I'm going to make the sizes all the way across the board 0, 0, and 0. So what's going to happen is this spawns small. It's then going to grow into its full size, and then I'm going to flatten it out and then to kill it. So what's going to happen is it's going to appear and then appear to grow upwards and outwards and then flatten out and then disappear, and it'll look like a splash. And if you've ever seen a video of a drop into a glass of milk or something like that, how you get that little ball that forms in the middle, and then the ring goes out and then collapses down. You'll see here in a second we're going to do exactly the same thing. So my first value is 0. That's my start point. My size is there at 0. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, look, halfway through its life, what I would like it to do is I would like it to then become full size. Okay, now you're still not seeing it. So let's go to the end here and say 1. And you notice it appears. That's because I've now given it a set life. It goes from 0, where it is not big at all, and you see how fast it's happening. You can't even see it in its small state. Then what it does is it grows to its full size by halfway through its life, okay, and then disappears at the end of its life. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go in here, and we're going to change the sizes of this thing. I'm going to say 1, 1, and 0.1. Right? Now it's all happening here at one time. If I go back, let's go back to spawn, and let's change that from 1500 to 1. And you can see what it's doing. All right, so what is happening is it's growing. I can look at this thing a little bit more on the edge. Make sure I can see it. I've lost it. But what it was doing here, there we go, it's over there. It's a little teeny, it's tiny. Let's see if I can zoom in on it. That's too far. There we go. So what's happening is it starts out in its first position. Go back down here to my size by line. In its first position, it is sized 0, 0, 0 on the X, Y, and Z. So it starts out as a pin drop or a pinpoint. Then halfway through its life, it goes to full size. In fact, if I wanted that splash to be bigger, I could say, let's make it 2, and it'll actually make this spike taller. All right. So we'll just do it. We'll just have it come up 1. So it starts out flat, grows up to its full size, and then what it does is at its third stage of its life, at the very end, it's going to stay at 1 and 1, which is the full width, but it's going to flatten back down to 1/10 of its size. And it looks like a splash that occurs, goes up, and then flattens back out again. Go back to my spawn here. Let's make sure I put this back to 1500 so I've got them all. And it's just all happening in one spot right there. Okay, now the last thing that I have to do to this one, now that I've got my size by life, it's doing everything that I want it to do. I might go back and change the material. It's doing everything that I want it to do, except for it needs to be spread out just like my raindrop system. My raindrop system is spread out over an area here. If I look at my initial location, 2200, 2205, and then 2200, 2201. Now, I don't really need, some of those things I need to change because of the way that this is going to work. But what I want to do is I want to go in and make sure that I've got the same settings over here for this one. Now, I could right-click and say location and get an initial location and go in and type in all those numbers again. But actually, there's another way to do that. If I click on my initial location here and I use a control drag, okay, it's control and then just left click and drag it over. What it does is it duplicates it and has the exact same settings in it, but it's a separate duplicate. In 3D modeling, there's something called a copy and something called an instance. And if you make a copy of something, you have two objects that look exactly alike, but they have no relationship between them at all. You can change the original, you can change the copy, you can do whatever you want to, and one doesn't affect the other. And then you have something called an instance, where if you make an instance, you have two things that look exactly the same, but there's this connection between the two that if you change the original, it changes the instance. Or if you change the instance, it changes the original. And in this particular case, we don't want that. I want a copy. So if I hold down Shift key and then left click and drag that and bring it over here and drop it, it brings over a copy and allows me to come in and make changes. Now the main changes that I want out of this one have to do with the fact that my particle system and my rain system is up relatively high in the world. So if I go back and look at my initial location here, it starts at 500 units up and it goes to 100 units below. Okay. What I want, however, is I don't want my raindrops appearing all over the place. I want my raindrops appearing basically on the ground. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in and I'm going to change these both to 1 and 1. Oops. That back to minus 2200. And this one here is going to be, actually I'll make that 0. So what I'm going to get is I'm going to get a line or a surface of my water drops right there. And they don't have to match up with the raindrops. They don't, and there's no way to do that. I just want them to be splashes on the ground. And if I pull this out of the way, and I go back and let's do a quick save on that and see if I can see those drops on the ground. I may have to come up until I see them or go down until I see them. I need to see exactly where they are. And I'll probably go in here and go to my left view and I can see they're up really high up here. See where they are? They're way up there. So what I'm going to do is let's go in and based off of where that thing is, let's drop that Z height to maybe minus 25 and see where it goes. Okay, bring that back over here. I had it at 1 and 0. Okay, and you can see where they are. Basically, I think what I'm going to want out of these is I should be able to maybe pull that entire system down to where it's just above the ground. Like that. And then I think what I'm going to have to do is I'll go back to my initial location on this one and let's see if I can't take that rain and we'll start the rain up higher. Change that to 1,000. and I'll end the rain at maybe about 0. Pull that back out of the way, and now I think that that's going to work. I've got enough rain up there, and I do have rain particles coming down here, but I want to make sure that that is as close to ground level as I can. I can get it. So I have to know which one of those objects is my ground level, so I'll just pull that down to where it's just touching it, and go back in and change my view back to perspective. And if I go in to play that game now, I should have splashes appearing on the ground. I may have lowered them too much, so I need to do a quick, let me pause this thing just for a sec just to make sure I know which of the, well, I can do that. I'll click on my ground plane there. There's my ground plane. Let's go back to my left view so I know, there it is, it's up there. It's that object up there. All right. So if I'm clicking on that particle system, I need to pull the particle system up to about there, so it's up above that ground plane. There we go. And then I'll make a little bit more adjustments to it. If it's slightly above the ground, that's okay. It's still going to look like it's on the ground. There we go. So they're in there, and they're probably not showing up real well on the screen, but they are in here, and I've got little splashes popping up around the world, and they're doing pretty much what I want them to do. They're hard to see because of the way that the fog system is in here. And again, I talked in the other thing about how the fog goes. So that's the second system. That's the rain system. First one I did was the raindrops. The second one here is the rain splashes. This one works with mesh data. Later on, when I go back and I show you how to reduce the size of your rain, we're going to actually use an actual raindrop, and we'll kind of show you why we use the raindrop, why I can use a physical object and not a particle. And I'll talk a little bit more about that then. But that's the second part of that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back and I'm going to do in a third one, I'm going to add another, actually I'm going to create it as its own particle system. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and make a fog system that looks like moving fog on the ground. I'll close that.